My name is Richard Yonck. I'm a futurist based in Seattle, Washington. I write, advise, consult, and speak to audiences about different aspects about emerging technologies. And in the course of doing that, one of the things that I focus on a lot is artificial intelligence. And so today I wanted to speak to you a little bit about a few key aspects about it as we look into the future, as we look into how this might apply to certain aspects and or implementations of design going forward. Let's start off, I'm not a designer, and I am certainly not well-versed in a lot of the vocabulary that you use, so excuse me if I diverge into some other types of talk from time to time. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about designing for a differently intelligent future. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here. And there we go. So when Tim and I had worked together in the past, we've sort of had some dialogue around a whole range of different topics, but certainly how AI is developing and changing our world, and what this really means to us as a society, us as people and human beings is I think really important, because there's a whole lot of very histrionic or very exaggerated wild kind of science fiction thinking around what AI is, what it does, what it will do. And I think it helps to have kind of a conversation that dives into a little more about what it really is. So in the course of my work, hopefully get there. In the course of my work, one of the things I wanted to do was to explore the nature and origins of intelligence and what that means, in order to have a better sense and understanding of what that might mean as we go forward, looking to our own future, looking at mostly the 21st century, though certainly this book, as you might determine by the subtitle, goes out a little further than that. But in the course of exploring this topic, one of the things that became really evident early on to me was the fact that there is no single definition of intelligence. And when I dove into the literature, dove into what other people had done looking at this, it was really obvious that it ran the gamut from the basic things we think of and talk about in terms of logic and performing certain kinds of very high-end cognitive processes, to different aspects about emotion, how we interact with each other and with our environment through that, different aspects of consciousness and so forth. So when I actually dove in, there was something like over 200 different kinds of definitions around what intelligence is. And one particular pair of researchers, Shane Legg and Marcus Hutter, had collected a really good comprehensive list of these. Shane actually went on to found DeepMind, which is tied to Google and very much at the forefront of AI. But it still didn't feel like it wasn't a satisfying definition, what they finally kind of came up with for me, because it didn't exclude certain things and it didn't include certain things. So in exploring from a few different ideas, I started looking at physics and ideas like complexity, and realized and came to the conclusion that actually, in many respects, intelligence is something that is almost inherent in our universe. It's not that it is simply imbued in some way, but that in the course of all of the thermodynamics, the generation of entropy that takes place, that there are these little pockets these concentrations of organization that slowly, incrementally take place, and for a range of reasons, some of them purely mathematical, that they ultimately lead to greater and greater degrees of complexity that self-replicate, lead to more processes. This leads to life and higher forms of, I don't want to say higher forms, it's a very judgmental statement, but from single-celled organisms to multicellularity to what we know of as fauna and animals and the plants in our world, all the way up to primates and ultimately to ourselves. So what this led to was a definition that essentially looked at intelligence as an emergent system's ability to respond to its environment in order to improve its conditions, perpetuate itself, and maximize its future freedom of action. Now, that's a mouthful, and it takes a little bit of parsing to really delve into it, but that last item, maximize future freedom of action, actually comes from a famous physicist who had looked at how a number of different types of systems self-generate. And this is something that is kind of at the core of how life and intelligence ultimately may have generated. So a definition like this allows us to look or to apply it to pretty much everything that we see in our world that we might, depending on how we define it, call intelligence, from a single-celled organism to multi-celled life, plants, higher non-mammalian intelligence, ourselves, and ultimately, maybe, eventually AI. There's a lot of people who want to say AI is already, intelligent, and really, in many respects, it's on its way, but it's not. It doesn't fulfill all of these criteria. It is something that is still very much a tool of our own. So it's not like it's suddenly appearing as some kind of overt force that is going to take over the world, as we love to talk about in science fiction and so forth, but it is something that is an increasingly intelligent system or tool that we use in order to achieve ends that ideally are human-based. What happens, unfortunately, is as some of these become more and more complex, they ultimately lead to actions or results that aren't necessarily what we anticipate. That's one of the issues or problems that occur with highly complex systems. So one of the things that I talk about frequently and write about frequently in my work is the idea of the ongoing coevolution of humanity and technology. And when you look at our history, you can actually see a very particular point of delineation, a very key inflection point that occurs around 3.5, possibly 4 million years ago. We have physical evidence to look to 3.5 million years ago, when one of our ancestors, a very basic primate, Australopithecus, started to create stone tools. Now, Australopithecus was not much more advanced based on cranial capacity and so forth than a chimpanzee. A drawing like this is actually a much later hominid, but what has been determined is the act of forming stone tools is not as simple as we kind of think from our experience with the Flintstones or whatever. It actually requires a huge amount of cognitive involvement that a lot of these early primates simply did not have. And in the course of performing this role over and over again across the years and ultimately across 150,000 generations, that's how successful this technology has been. 150,000 generations, it actually changed our brains. It actually led to not shifts, but actually rebuilding of certain regions of our brain. A anthropologist who works with some neuroscientists, Dietrich Stout, wrote in Scientific American a few years ago about his work, in which he, in studying this form of stone tool making, is called stone napping, the actual striking of a fractionable piece of stone, usually something like flint or what have you, with a harder hammer stone. It takes a lot of coordination, a lot of patience, a lot of ability to follow through in a very sequential manner in terms of the process. And so he had volunteers learn this process and study them with MRI and so forth. And in the course of doing this, found that certain regions of the brain, after about 100 hours, which was about the minimum amount of time to become moderately proficient at this task, certain regions of the brain had actually changed, had actually developed. Now, that was a modern human being. These early hominids did not have the advantage of a lot of the capabilities that we very much take for granted. The high level executive function, the actually things like a certain level of eye-hand coordination, different aspects of being able to follow a sequential set of processes, and also the ability to pass this information along. These were creatures that were essentially pre-language. They, based on genetics, based on analysis of certain aspects of physiology, they wouldn't have had anything like the complex compound language that we have and use today. So in the course of this work with stone tools over literally millions of years, we see a rapid change, a rapid growth and development in the cranial capacity that coincides with a range of different milestones in our development and evolution, ultimately leading to ourselves. We have actually, if you up at the top, you'll see it's actually flipped. Neanderthals actually have a slightly higher cranial capacity than we do on average, but both we and the Neanderthals have a common ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis, that probably also had the capability of speech, was probably the early first users of fire, and showed certain other cultural developments that we start to mark as a modern human moving into the last 400,000 years or so. So from there, we continue to evolve, but at the same time, something new is coming along. We're starting to develop and evolve technology. Technology developed because of us, but because of our work with technology, technology changed and evolved us as well. We actually evolved and bootstrapped each other. We raised technology up, and it has raised up and changed us. If you look at and study ideas like neuroplasticity, you'll see that almost every task, almost every interaction we have with technology actually changes us, actually changes our neural structure. And this is ultimately how we learn. But some of these processes become permanent, become embedded in our genetics, become embedded in our culture, and ultimately have taken us from being a relatively simple primate to a global spanning civilization, which is where we are today. And as you might note from just looking at a relatively simple and obviously simplified graphic like this, there's a significant acceleration that takes place over time. The changes that have occurred in our society since the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, is only the last 400 or 500 years. It really hasn't been it's a drop in the bucket compared to the entire span of evolution. That's how much acceleration has occurred over the span of time. So as you're looking at and thinking about the world that's going to be created and designed in the course of the next few decades through the 21st century, just imagine how significant those changes are going to be, how immense. You're going to have children and grandchildren that are going to be operating technologies that are going to probably flummox you. And that's been kind of an ongoing trend more and more over the past couple of centuries, really. So in the course of developing our technologies, one of the things that we do is we create interfaces. Now, interfaces are something that we typically think of in terms of computers. It's something that really originates from 50, 75 years ago. We started with hardwired computers that could really only be operated and programmed by people with very significant degrees, what amount eventually would be called a computer scientist. We moved on to ideas like punch cards and punch tape. And then we started to have the command line interface. You might remember DOS or some of the other early command lines. But then in the 1980s, we really start to see the public have access to what's called GUIs, the graphic user interfaces. And that really started democratization of these devices and made them more and more accessible to pretty much everyone, even people who don't have significant computer backgrounds. Until we get to the last decade or two, we start to move into natural user interfaces. These are the touch screens, the voice recognition, the gesture recognition, all of the technologies that basically just respond to us. And this is one of the really interesting and key aspects about interface development, is that it's been this progression through time of making our systems work more and more like us, or in the way that is in keeping with our needs, makes it accessible to us. Early computer technology, we had to do all the heavy lifting. We had to use our brains to kind of talk in a way that the computers could understand. Now it's reversed. We actually have systems that can work with our natural means of communication, whether that's language, as I wrote about in Heart of the Machine, even things like emotion can now be read and interpreted. There's a whole range of dispute about that we can talk about later. But the idea is that the purpose of these technologies, or these interfaces, is to make our systems work more and more like us. Back in 1980, Brenda Laurel wrote for a book about interfaces for Apple Computer, in which she wrote in the introduction, "The greater the difference between two entities, the greater the need for a well-designed interface." So in thinking about how do we interact with our technologies, how do we interact with our computers and anything else that basically operates through some aspect of the digital world, how do we make that as easy, transparent, as frictionless as we possibly can? And that's kind of an exciting idea to think about. What are the interfaces of tomorrow? Where are we going to go with all of this? I'm just going to back up for just 1 second and say that when we talk about an interface, really every single technology has always needed and had an interface. Even when we were back talking about something as simple as a shovel or something like that, the handle was the use of a lever to be able to increase our ability to it added to our strength. This was a means of interfacing with the device in order to extend and expand or rescale initially our muscles, but now we're using technology to incrementally rescale and act both our minds and our senses. We can look to the edge of the universe today. We can look into an atom. These are all made possible because not just of technology, but because of the interfaces that act as the intermediaries between ourselves and those technologies. So one small little diversion before we move on into what the future of design and intelligence might look like is years ago, Stuart Brand, who founded the Whole Earth Catalog and was a co-founder of Long Now Foundation, put together an idea called pace layering, which I really am fascinated by and think is really important. This is the idea that different layers of our world, different aspects of our culture move and change at different rates. So the fashion world, the arts, all of that changes and plays with ideas like that. And that is a really important role. But you've got, as you move through these sets of layers, these different sections move and change more and more slowly. And that's actually a good thing because the layers at the bottom are essentially adding stability to our society, to our world. They are the foundations of our culture. And those things that are changing more rapidly at the top, technology and the arts and so forth, those are bringing change. Now, when those layers get too far out of sync, when one moves and changes too fast and some others aren't keeping up, we have friction in our world, we have problems. So whether we're talking about what that means for our interaction with nature and climate change, or the idea of regulation and governance and what we need to do to be able to protect ourselves or not overprotect ourselves as new technologies are developed and so forth, that all comes into play. This is kind of a way to visualize that and have a conversation around some of those ideas. It's not a deep tool. Well, it's a deep tool, but it's not a detailed one. You have to kind of open that up and explore what that means. But one of the things that Stuart Brand mentioned that I love as a quote is that these upper layers, the fast layers, fast learns and slow remembers. And it's an interesting way of transferring what essentially can happen in our own minds about how we learn, how we retain things and so forth, into culture, into something that is actually a way of conceiving that as we think about how we build the future. So a few years back, I wrote and talked about a field called artificial emotional intelligence, also known as emotion AI, originally known as effective computing, which didn't get a lot of, it confused people. So that was it started mostly around the mid-1990s and developed at a lot of different research labs, particularly MIT Media Lab for the next, well, it's still developing, but by about the late 2000s, you start to see commercialization of some of these technologies, some of these ideas. And what they are systems that can, read, interpret, and interact with human emotion. Now, that is a really powerful interface, and it's also a potentially dangerous one when we think about how we engage with technology in our world. These are systems that, when we say it reads our emotion, what it's doing is it's reading certain outward expressions. Now, this is something that we've utilized ever since we were, before we were primates. I mean, there were animals interacted with each other through emotion, through as a means of engagement, as a means of understanding each other. And I strongly believe that for ourselves, it played a key role in our the development of consciousness for higher primates. This, though, when you only apply it to what is that outward expression, that becomes a little problematic. That's not necessarily accurate. Certainly when you apply it to something like a facial recognition in an AI. And so there's a whole conversation and dialogue about that going forward. But I have my suspicions that as AI becomes more and more, has deeper capabilities, that it's actually going to be able to mine this information a lot better than it does today. So the concept is that there are elements, microexpressions that take place on our faces, and from these we can discern what is a person feeling or thinking. Well, unless you have some pretty significant ideas about how consciousness works, theory of mind, and so forth, you're only going to get a very superficial idea with that. But it is an important change and interface for us to be considering as we look ahead. In terms of how can it be used and misused, you've got here just very recently in China, in Beijing, the Canon technology section there implemented a smile technology. And what this requires is there's about 5 different components to it for printing, for access to offices and so forth. And you have to smile in order to gain entry, in order to be able to print your documents, in order to be able to schedule a meeting and so forth. The idea being that smiling employees are happy employees, and that improves company efficiency. That's pretty scary stuff on a lot of different levels. And obviously, we've had quite a few articles in the West about what this might mean if this was to expand. But this idea that we can discern what is going on in a person's mind just by the outward expression is going to become more and more capable as we move into what's being called the third wave of AI. Now, very quickly, back starting the middle of the last century, we had the workshop at Dartmouth that kind of launched the AI even idea. It wasn't even called the artificial intelligence yet at that point. And that was really the first wave of AI. It was a very, very rule-based means of trying to create in a step-by-step manner different forms of AI. As just a side note, the founders of that workshop in 1954 at Dartmouth, who included Marvin Minsky and a few other major players in the AI world over the past half century, they thought that by the end of the summer, they could have dealt with some of the major problems with developing an AI that would be able to think like we do. They might have been off a few generations there. So then we get into last about 20 years ago, we start to move into an era, the second wave of AI. These are the connectionist models, the neural networks that starting about 10, 12 years ago started to really become capable of some amazing things. And so from there, we now have the artificial pattern recognition that takes place, the ability to be able to rapidly identify what an image is from just its pixels, things like that. It has led to some more and more really interesting and scary forms of AI in the past couple of years, which we'll touch on in a little bit. But the third wave of AI is really about explaining, is about giving AI reasoning capabilities to be able to perform something closer to abstract thought, to be able to learn much more like we do in what's known as one-shot or zero-shot learning, where you only need one or two examples of something like we do as a child learning. We see a picture of a dog, see a couple pictures of a dog, we know what a dog is from that point forward. Currently with neural networks, you have to prime them, teach them with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images, and they incrementally learn from a statistical basis what a dog at least looks like. So this is a much more, we'll call it capable AI, one that, while it will think very, very differently from ourselves, will perform roles and tasks that are much more in keeping with how we think the human mind works. The problem is that some of these are going to, most of these will do this in a very, very different way than we do. And that sometimes is going to lead to problems or unexpected consequences and so forth. If you think about how you recognize a person's face, it's very, very different from how a pattern recognition system recognizes a person's face. So that's just one kind of example of that kind of difference. But what's going to happen as we move through this is we're going to see the use of more and more big data, more and more information that ultimately informs these systems, and is something that's going to raise a lot of ethical issues and considerations for how we utilize it, how we design our world, how we design our systems. The big data is going to really already is leading to this enormous problem of what I call algorithmic influence, the things that are going on things like Facebook and other aspects of social media, where our minds are being directed, redirected, our behaviors are being tweaked based on enormous amounts of data, and what is now a two-way conversation between ourselves and these technologies. It's not how we think of a two-way conversation, but it does exist, and what this does is it creates a feedback loop. And that's really, really powerful and has big potential problems. But one of the things to remember is it's not the AI that's ultimately at the controls. These are still tools that are being developed and used by human beings. It's the human beings who are directing these, and we need to think of it in those terms. This is not Skynet taking over and looking to destroy the human race or any of that kind of thing. This is about human beings being driven by the basic economics that they always have been, and that's important. So when we talk about algorithmic influence, what does that really mean, and how could that be used? Well, let's just step back a decade and for an example that I love to give. From 2011, some researchers who had developed an algorithm went to work at Microsoft Research for a year or two, I think. They were Adam Sedelic and John Crum. And what they did was they had something like 300, 400 Microsoft employees, remember this is 2011, where some GPS trackers, these all day, wherever they went, and I think many of them were paid for performing this, taking part. And at the end of several months, they collected all of this data, plugged it into their algorithm, and they found that they could predict where any of those individuals would be within a 1-block radius on any day at any hour with 87.3% accuracy up to a year and a half later. Now, it's scary stuff, but it also says a lot about just how repetitive and predictable we are in many respects. When you think about our patterns of work and shopping and family life and everything, we do tend to follow some fairly defined patterns that maybe another individual can't spot very easily, but boy, big data and AI can spot it really, really easily and really well. So that's a decade ago. So think about what that might mean for where we are today and where we're going to be a decade or two from now. So where are we for time here? We good? Another, okay. So a very quick little example I like to give is from a scenario I wrote for one of the books, Ginza Tokyo, May 17th, 2027. A fashionable young woman window shops in a trendy retail district searching for a new purse. Her Louis Vuitton eyewear overlaid data onto her field of view. These augmented reality glasses provide pricing and reviews as her gaze passes over different items in the store windows. As she nears one of the stores, its on-street camera uploads her image to the store's main computer system. This is fed to an online service that analyzes her outfit and calculates there's a 73.6% chance she would purchase a particular skirt if it was offered at their first tier markdown price. Another software service quickly renders a high-res rotatable 3D avatar of the shopper wearing the skirt along with a number of other items and accessories. The store transmits a personalized ad directly to her glasses. The woman glances briefly at the ad but isn't interested. Real-time analysis of her expression, posture, and gait inform the computer that she probably already has a similar skirt. But that's all the extra information that the store's computer needs. Milliseconds later, it receives an update from a big data analytics service reporting there's a 92.7% probability the shopper would buy one of the leather jackets that they just got in for the new season. A second ad is quickly sent to her glasses, showing her avatar wearing the jacket along with a 30-minute flash coupon. The entire interchange has taken only a few dozen paces. Moments later, she steps into the store and the sale is quickly made. So this is an example of a feedback loop. This is something that I talk about in terms of what I call predatory marketing or predatory sales. We have interactions with human salespeople all the time. They want to get the sale, you want to get the best deal, you're back and forth and you're reading each other and so forth. Here you have something that is emotionless, that is being driven by very particular scripts, very particular processes, but you have an opportunity here for what's called an optimization process. Essentially, optimization processes in computing are something where you try to maximize a particular result. And we're being turned into this in the course of these kinds of interactions, whether we're on Facebook, whether we're in a future shopping scenario. These are things that we have to think about. What kind of a world are we creating as we build out these systems that interact with us in our daily lives? The cameras, the sensors that were described in that scenario aren't very far away. We're already building a lot of this out with what's called the Internet of Things. Our world is the different companies are planning for something on the order of trillions of sensors, cameras, devices throughout our urban and rural environments in the course of the coming decades. And that's going to bring a lot of changes to what is privacy, what can we do to protect ourselves and so forth. Another really interesting interface that you might have heard about this past year is what's called targeted dream incubation, TDI. Now, this is early days still. It's of limited success, but that this is being explored to such a degree is frightening. It's frightening enough that when this particular Coors ad was launched at the beginning of the year around the Super Bowl, that 40 dream researchers actually signed a petition calling for regulation of this technology because it is such a slippery slope. MIT Media Lab, some researchers there created a device called Dormio for being able to identify the correct time in your sleep state to introduce certain stimuli to promote certain kinds of dreams. And the idea of being able to do this for promoting product, changing people's attitudes, ideas, political views, what have you, even if you're only tweaking or adjusting or nudging 1%, that's a huge deal, and it's a huge thing for the marketers and the advertisers out there as well. So when we talk about interfaces, probably the, call it holy grail, that people are looking to is eventually being able to just interact with our technologies via our thoughts. Brain-computer interfaces are not new, but they are something that we tend to associate with science fiction. They go back, actually, DARPA started doing work with this in the 1980s. And today we have systems that can allow people to type, to operate wheelchairs, to be able to send tweets via their thoughts. It's still very, very rudimentary. You've got ideas like Neuralink from Elon Musk, and Kernel is another. There's several different projects being done along this line. There's a lot of ethical issues. As soon as you start talking about putting something in somebody's head on an elective basis rather than to try to repair or restore some lost function, you get into some really, really challenging ethical questions. But that said, we are going to incrementally get to that point somehow or another, because that's been the overall progression for all of our interface technology. It's been making our systems more and more capable of interacting as in a frictionless way as we possibly can. Now, you may think, why would anybody want to do this? But if you have some kind of competitive advantage, whether it's because you can offload certain resources or processing, thinking about certain ideas or communications to outside systems, and it gives you a competitive advantage, those economics tend to drive an awful lot in our society. So I think that it's going to take a fair bit of time still, but we can't think that it's not very, very probable or even inevitable. So as we move into something like that, what happens when you develop systems that are tied so closely to your own thoughts that they become hackable because they are internet connected, like everything else in our world right now that we can access from the internet, it can be hacked. So that's something that should give us some pause as we look ahead and think ahead to what that world might look like. So as we talk about and think about the idea of how do we more actively use artificial intelligence for design, I've just run through a few quick examples and then get into our conversation Q&A, try not to drag this on. 2008, NASA had used what's called an evolutionary algorithm, wherein they needed a particular antenna for a particular satellite system. It needed to be small, needed to be highly efficient, needed to meet a number of criteria. So they plugged it into what was called an evolutionary algorithm, in which you have a fitness solution, and essentially you're changing certain parameters over generations, perpetuating the successful ones. It's analogous to how natural evolution is supposed to work, or part of it anyway. And they came up with this wild antenna that no human engineer probably would have come up with, but it was incredibly efficient and worked incredibly well. So that's one kind of example. You've heard of maybe you've heard of GANs, generative adversarial networks, which are have really taken off in the past couple of years. A few years ago, just as a kind of a advertising idea, Nutella threw design elements into a GAN and generated something like 3,000, 4,000 different Nutella designs. I don't think many or any of these got to market, but the point was that here you have an opportunity to have AI work alongside a designer to try to explore possible spaces that maybe just a human alone wouldn't consider. A famous artist did something similar with chair design a couple of years ago, and not every one of these, by the way, is functional. This is a zoomed in zoom in of the graphic. There's something like 3,000 of these chairs. It creates some really interesting ways of utilizing these tools to help spark our own ideas and creativity and so forth. So there's definitely some positive ways to utilize these technologies. At the same time, we're looking ahead to an era where you can have human faces, human voices, even video that doesn't exist in the real world. It's just simply created inside a machine by bits and bytes. All of these images are from a website, I believe it's called These People Don't Exist, .com. All of these are pseudo celebrities that actually don't exist anywhere. They're just simply computer creations. And they're doing that with voices, they're doing that with images and a lot of other things. We go back, there was the problem 40 years ago, trying to take a celebrity like Fred Astaire, and even after they had long died, and utilize them in a commercial. This raises a lot of ethical issues. Last month, the Anthony Bourdain documentary came out. They deep-faked his voice for certain scenes, and that's really questionable ethical territory when you think about it. They took his, he's high, how many hundreds or thousands of hours of recordings do we have of Anthony Bourdain? They could feed that into a GAN and have it ultimately generate new words, transforming somebody else's speaking and turning it into Anthony Bourdain's voice. Early this year, a motorcycle riding Twitter teen celebrity in Japan, turned out that in fact she was a 50-year-old man. That was a little bit of a surprise for part of the internet. And then here recently, musician from Europe, musician and composer Holly Herndon, has created a digital twin that is a really interesting idea and use of design and modern AI concepts like not just GANs, but blockchain and NFTs to create a platform wherein users and artists are able to use be able to create a song, have it come out in essentially her voice, and then it's voted on by a group of she calls a DAO. We won't get into details. Ultimately, there's opportunity for rights and profit sharing for artists here that is really interesting ground to explore. And I think this is really, really innovative. So ultimately, I think we're looking ahead to a really interesting world wherein we are going to be interacting, working more and more with our technologies, our AIs, continuing this co-evolution with ourselves and technology, raising each other up, changing and advancing each other. But in the course of it, we are now getting to a stage that has a lot of really challenging and ethical issues to consider as well. And so we need to be very aware of what we're dealing with as we move it forward into this new world. Thank you so much.
That was awesome.
I mean, unshare.
Yeah, that was awesome. And
Thank you.
I want to give time for I'm sure many of the students are going to have questions, but right out of the gate, I can't help but sort of jump in with one question uh, around the idea of what we call what we consider to be intelligence. And when we think about sort of separating ourselves, this is really sort of triggered by your slides, is that, we tend to think of what separates us from machines as human beings. We tend to think of sort of the positive ideas of that, of sort of like our creativity or so forth. But there's an interesting kind of, kind of it's a riddle of our human intelligence. Is one of the things that makes us very unique from other species is our propensity to cruelty. And in that idea of our relationship, and it's come up in class because when you look at a lot of the ways in which technology has now sort of infused itself into rites of passage for young people and the way in which they sort of have to deal with technology as they grow up, is that we sort of assert ourselves as human beings in that technological framework, in our ability to kind of manipulate it to be cruel in ways that we could never imagine. And it's sort of that interesting aspect of cruelty is a learning process. It's a horrible, there's a very negative aspect to it, but we have to, when we're thinking about design frameworks, we have to recognize that there's a learning there and it's unique. We're unique in that way that we do that. We ghost people. We do all these kinds of things in terms of with technology. Is that how might we direct that kind of uniqueness towards something that is more positive and sort of useful? I would say. I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Tons. That's a huge can of worms, Pandora box, whatever you want to use for a metaphor here. So I guess first and foremost, I totally agree. We are really facing that just in terms of the kind of almost dehumanizing aspect of social media and how it is reducing empathy across our society, not necessarily uniformly, but very significantly. And it's not just social media. I mean, you're right. It's so many technologies as they develop, as they come online. People are exploring all kinds of space. How do I use this? What can I do with it? There are people who are not necessarily nice, and they're not going to be nice in any era or generation, and they're going to use it a certain way, but it also influences the rest of us too. So part of the design process, to my mind, has to involve what's essentially a technology assessment, to be able to early on have an iterative process in which not just the technological issues are well explored, but the ethical and sociological ones too, so that we end up having at least some consideration of how things can go wrong. You didn't have the scientists who created ARPANET in 1969 were not thinking about how we were going to be using the internet in 2021, I can promise you. They were only exploring this as a means of being able to easily communicate between research labs and the government at universities in a situation where everyone trusted everyone else. So we had this, the foundations that developed on ended up lending to so many vulnerabilities that we experience today. Now, you go and you develop a technology and then you throw it out into a world with 8 billion people. That's a huge number of experiments that can take place in parallel all at once. And those in that space, you're going to have people find all kinds of ways to utilize that technology that the inventors never imagined, never thought that they were going to be able to see occur. And that is why I think there's needs to be a little more of a directed design process that takes in a lot of other elements as we pretty much develop almost anything in our future world. Too many of these technologies are going to be very, very powerful.
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting because the flip side of cruelty is actually empathy, which is kind of like, I guess I'm touching upon kind of, we don't think enough about that kind of framework of intelligence. But the technology kind of it's sloppy and sort of almost sort of brutish in its way of sort of allowing that kind of negative aspect of empathy to kind of propagate in many ways. And one of the other things that came up in our conversations in class is, whether or not robots should have faces. And so if you talk about your original kinds of groups of people who all have a shared belief and they're like, oh, we're all working on this. So we could say like, oh, we trust these machines because they're tools. We know what they're doing. But when you start moving it out into this more ambiguous world of this empathetic, flip side, cruel kind of world of millions of people using this technology, putting faces on machines can change that dynamic in ways that we could never imagine. So I was curious what you think about that.
Absolutely. So I think it applies to far more than just faces. I think that anytime that we're moving into a mode or an aspect of representation that moves through and ultimately past what's known as the blanking here. Anyway, the point is that as they get too human-like, we're put at a little bit of a disadvantage. Beg your pardon if that noise is too loud. I'll put on headphones. So I guess my sense is, in the course of having this discussion earlier, did you guys touch on Ex Machina, the movie?
Yeah, some students have referenced Ex Machina.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things, you basically have a robot with drives that are not human, but that we tend to, as an audience and as the protagonist in the movie, project this humanness onto it, when in fact it's simply moving through a series of steps to be able to gain its freedom. And again, that freedom it sounds very human oriented, but in fact is something that has been shown by certain AI researchers to be just inherent in the nature of developing systems that are capable of having some kind of goal process. So in terms of what that means for, do we allow faces? Do we allow human-like voices? Do we allow, why are so many robots? Why are so many voice assistants female? Why is this happening? And what's the logic behind it? Is it, on the one hand, some people say, oh, they seem less threatening that way, and the public picks up on them more. But there's a whole range of not just undertone, but subtext in all of that choice and discussion that we really need to be thinking about very, very carefully. Gendering any kind of tool, we've tended to do it in terms of our ships and our guns and our all kinds of devices over the years. But so there's a kind of a natural trend. It's just our nature of anthropomorphizing in order to be able to interact with and acknowledge and recognize aspects of our world that aren't us. But it gets dangerous as we move more and more into a world where these are more and more intelligent systems.
Yeah, we need to, I think that we're entering kind of a new phase of looking at, you had talked about these interfaces, of thinking of these interfaces differently. And one of those areas that touches upon what you just mentioned is the area of cyranoids and digital twins. So the idea of machines as an augmentation, as opposed to, something that you're kind of mirroring, is that, the idea of Cyranoids is because of Cyrano de Bergerac, is that if you had, you had a representation of a machine to do things, but it should augment things about you. It's not replacing things that you do. So it changes kind of the relationship. And then you ask that machine, you would probably program that machine differently, because it would be like, what do I need to bring out about myself that would be positive and would be useful, as opposed to sort of deadening. What we have a lot with technology is kind of deadening, because it's sort of taking away a lot of our agency in the things that we use. We have a question, Alana.
Yeah, I have a question about so like in a future in which AI can complete almost all, like, first of all, like almost all automated tasks, and then become increasingly like emotionally in tune, and even like design and do what we would think of as like creative processes. What in your mind are the skills that are most important for humans to have now and going forward?
Sure. Fantastic question. Thank you. It really kind of depends a little bit on how far out you're looking. If we're talking about the next decade or two, we continue, often we talk about the tasks and the roles that remain either, more emotional, more human and personal interaction, or they are processes that are just a level of creativity and or intellectual insight and wisdom that we're just not going to have these systems capable of for that time frame. If you're talking about far enough out, 100 years, 150 years, which we may not ourselves have to worry about, is then you're moving into a period where really, if we're just talking about the basic economics and having a job and what roles do we perform, we are moving into a period where if we leave it to our current economics, our existing economic system, that's going to simply not work. It's going to go to a point where the economic system, the drivers of the economy fail, because we can't just have 7.5 billion people unemployed. So we would be at that point needing to change how do we operate and run a society? Do we have all of these pre-existing assumptions about what life is, what work is, how economies and transactions work, and so forth? That doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it's always been or how it always will be. So I think that's it's not meant to be a waffly answer, but it's meant to recognize that the conditions are going to change. So I hope that answers or addresses your question.
Sarah, you have a question?
Yeah, for me, when I think about like the future, and it's kind of scary what we can, like the possibilities within technology and what can happen. I think we had a lot of conversations on like, yeah, we can do this, but should we? And I think that the question with that is also like, not everyone has the same ethics, right? So like not everyone's like, there's always going to be someone who's going to want to do it, who's going to want to develop a technology, like you said, like maybe an AI that's like completely self-sustaining, and maybe it's going to be dangerous. Who knows what they'll come up with? And I was like, how do we restrict that? Like, how do we build laws on that? And also like, just because one country has laws on something doesn't mean every country's gonna. And like, makes me think of like, the nuclear weapons, because someone built it, there's gonna, the other ones are also gonna want to build it, because then there's that like battle between power. Like if someone has this technology, you're also gonna need to have it. So then how do we then there's gonna be a future where all of this is possible. So how do we restrict that? Like, how do we make sure that that future is not like dangerous?
Incredibly insightful question. I think that's the $20 million question, really. We have been talking about this for a good long time. As you say, we've had to contend with it through the nuclear era. Not that that's over, but we've kind of come to a level of balance in our world where, yeah, we worry about it, but maybe not the same way we worried about it in the 1960s and 70s. But it's still very much a problem and still something that we have to contend with. There, you're talking about technology that is really hard. It's not something, as much as we love to put it into a television program or whatever, people are not going to build nuclear weapons beyond a dirty bomb in their basement. It is simply not in the capability of most human beings. However, we are moving into an era where we have more and more technologies that put incredible power into the hands of anyone. Maybe not everyone has the skills, but you just look at being able to shut down a power grid or a pipeline across the world, maybe by somebody in their basement or whatever. That's incredible power. And that comes because of the nature of how the internet was designed. And we kind of have to put some safeguards and brakes on there, and or create a new and different version of the internet or what have you, in order to kind of get away from that. Technology and change has always been scary. Go back 200 plus years, the Luddites were absolutely terrified about, having these sewing looms, mechanical sewing looms, mechanized, come into the factories and put them out of work. That was their livelihood. That was a way of, and so there was, a response to it. We know today that didn't do away with all jobs in, any of the related fields, but it certainly changed and transformed them. We're going to, as a culture, have to adapt our different systems as we move along. As we saw with that pace layers example, you have the need for regulation. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is regulation tends to take a long time to come along for new technologies because they're not well understood. And then when they do, they tend to overshoot, or often overshoot, and overregulate. And so there's this push-pull until you get to a point where it kind of stabilizes and is reasonably manageable. You think about how jets and planes are regulated and directed by the FAA and so forth, things like that. This is one way that we adjust and change and adapt to technological change. But in the course of it, there are all kinds of problems and challenges that arise. So yeah, we have to design early on with the idea that there are going to be people who are going to misuse it. So what can we do to prevent that? And then plan an iterative set of stages that we're going to have to deal with it. One of the biggest problems, lots of people talk about wanting to ban this or ban that. It's all but impossible in our world. Inventions come about when they are at a certain we are at a particular technological level to be able to do so. When the infrastructure, the economics, the knowledge, the basics of the physics are all in place, then there's almost no stopping a new technology from coming about. You weren't going to invent an iPhone in 1930, but you sure weren't going to keep it from being invented until 2050. There was a point in time when everything was aligned, and that was going to drive it. And you weren't there. It's why you see several inventors for the television, the telephone, the light bulb, all at the same time within a very short period of multiple people develop a particular technology at the same time. So long answer.
I want to get to Tyler. I just want to sort of insert a sort of a comment and question around that, because this issue of pace layering that you were just mentioning, and this relationship between slow and fast sort of came up in sort of our work in a lecture this week about who kind of defines the future. So when we think about like who's deciding what our future will be, agreed, we have, there's technological invention, we get iPhones or we get autonomous vehicles or so forth. But a lot of the economics of, I think of most recently these billionaires going into space right now, and kind of defining kind of what that invention is towards a narrative that has other kind of more ambiguous meaning. So the idea of, it's not just about going to space, it's actually about luxury travel. It's a different idea of the use of that space. And our participation in that changes because, when Elon Musk says the future of cities is centered around inventions that he knows and he owns, he has the ability, because of investment around that, to define a lot of things that we then have to catch up to. So the extent to which I think that issue of pace layering right now is becoming very complex, because the speed by which technological advancement is actually working is that, social media is an example of that. We have Facebook, but we didn't realize actually what Facebook was actually doing to us. And so we're actually ill and sick from this thing, but actually the reason that it created this future for us, which we're now, we have futures now that are moving so quickly that we have to undo them. And we wonder if we can undo them. And so it's kind of I guess, there's not an answer to this, but I guess it shows how complex that issue, and the pace layering is such a great way of kind of being able to see some of that. Tyler, do you have a question?
I have like a question / comment. Sarah kind of got me thinking about how would we not cause problems for the future generation? Because I start to think about like the Industrial Revolution and the pollutants, and then now this generation is now our strategic design process is more based around sustainable options because of the effects of the industrial stuff and whatever. But I start to think about that with technology, and like everything that's being made in a sense is like to help you and assist you. How does that not get out of control and like start causing issues for 20 years down the line?
Fantastic question, and it is there's no simple answer, but there are, what you're kind of defining here is the role in terms of designer to be responding or reacting to what has gone on in the past versus being proactive and looking ahead to how is this going to impact the future, and what is our responsibility in regard to it. So there's a whole little, not school, but there's an area of thinking right now around the idea of kind of creating responsible futures, being able to look out and think about our choices for future generations, the idea of being good ancestors, basically. There's the concept, I want to say Iroquois. Anyway, the idea of 7-generation thinking, the idea that the choices that you make need to be considered not just in terms of how it impacts you, not just how it's going to impact your children, but literally how does this affect people 7 generations out? And there's a whole dialogue about why 7 and so forth, but it plays, I think it's gaining some traction and needs to be part of our conversation going forward, because you're exactly correct that we are moving into a time where everything we do, there's this huge question. No one thought 10 years ago, Facebook, oh yeah, this is going to be, making these enormous impacts on the stability of our, somewhat fragmenting society. But it's always I think that it's something where we have to actively be changing our thinking in terms of who we are as responsible parties. And, granted, not everybody is going to want to do that, but I think that it is something that is an important step in our evolution as a society. That's the other component in all of this, is that, we're not done. We are still, developing, we're still evolving, and that's culturally as well as everything else. Just the cultural evolution is happening more and more rapidly, and it's really challenging for us to stay in step with, everything that's going on. I do this for a living, and there's no way to keep up with everything.
I think that we don't pay attention enough to dissent. And you had mentioned the Luddites, which have become synonymous with stupid, but actually the Luddites are actually getting a lot of sort of attention again, because like they were right about a lot of things. And the question is it's not the fact that we don't have advancement, but we're not including that. It's like, why did the Amish suddenly become synonymous with trendy? Because we started going, maybe we got this wrong. Maybe we need to slow things down. But the problem is that we don't think about including that into our intelligence algorithm. When we're our cycles are 2 years. This is the point I meant about that pace layering, is that when I think of the decisions that are made for 50 years out, they have to do with making a pitch for investment, at a VC company. It's a lot of that kind of way in which you raise capital ends up defining a lot of other kinds of things that are outside of that. And then we go, oh, well, that's what we have. We have a sharing economy. Well, what is that? Nobody owns anything anymore. Okay, so then you have other sets of problems and other sets of problems.
Sure.
Our ability to kind of bring some of that in, is a challenge right now, I would say. What do you think? Is there anything on that comes to mind?
Let's see. I had about a dozen different thoughts while you were going through that. So I think that first of all, just response to that last part, we've known for quite some time, and we need to get away from this idea of thinking in terms of quarterly profits. Is that that's what kind of drives so much of our economy, and ultimately that drives all of our decision making going forward. What's our exit strategy 2 years from now after we launch our startup? I mean, that's not responsible. That's just looking out for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm trying to pull back one of the other important aspects. I think that ultimately we're going to have to shift who and how we do things. Now, remind me that first element that you were talking about on
dissent and the Luddites.
Thank you. Yes, the dissent and Luddites. So we don't incorporate it enough into our design process, but we are these days starting to incorporate it more and more into the futures process, which actually is starting to interact and overlap more and more with design. So when you look at what are called weak signals in futures work, do you touch on this at all in your course?
Well, we do the mapping around disruptive and emergent signals. Yeah.
So weak signals, one of the ideas there is that there are elements in the world, in society, that they're just these little hints. They may be nothing, but they also may be the canary in the coal mine. And more and more, one of the areas that futurists want to look to are the fringe elements in society, the countercultures, the areas, the regions of our world that, okay, why is this happening? Why is this manifesting now? And does it portend for something, bigger, years or even decades down the way?
This touches upon the talk that we're proposing about whether, whether subcultures have a future, and whether AI could actually have its own subculture. I was curious, I mean, without sort of giving away too much, is like, did you have any kind of like snippet of thought on that, of whether or not subcultures, or is that inherently human, subcultures?
I think I haven't delved enough into it, and I don't think it's a question of giving too much away. I think we can count on everyone to protect our ideas here. No, I think that part of it is a function of where is the technology. When I talk about where AI is right now, it's like, yeah, no, I don't see AI having a subculture in anything but the most human-directed algorithmic method, like a Facebook ultimately, but indirectly generating a QAnon or what have you. Not that it originated with Facebook, but that's the idea. Looking ahead, when I talk about the idea of a third wave of AI that moves us into a period where artificial intelligence, while still thinking differently from ourselves, is more and more capable of aspects that we think of as various forms of reasoning and various forms of abstract thought. There we start moving into some different areas, because what are we going to do with the technology? Are we going to let the technology create its own independent, autonomous corporations, for instance? If it does that, what are its drivers and what does it want, essentially? Want being kind of a loaded word there, but nevertheless, once you get to that point, then yeah, there's all kinds of ways and reasons and logic for why it might try to generate subcultures. Whether it's to achieve an end and direct human behavior in a certain direction, or something else that, I'm not even going to be able to come up with because I'm not an AI right now. So I think that it's going to happen, but we're not there yet in a direct way. But like I say, algorithmic influence.
It's kind of interesting because it's like, if you look at something and you would mention QAnon, again, it's always interesting to find the things that are uniquely human, both that are positive, but also negative as well. And one of the sort of unique aspects of humans is their ability to believe in conspiracies. And so believe information beyond any other evidence. So like, if you're given all the evidence, a machine would never do that. It would be like, oh, that's illogical. It doesn't, right. But we have the ability for illogical thought. We actually, and the other thing I would say is that we have the ability to make things that have no use, that they like, it doesn't, like, we could say they have meaning, and the difference between meaning and use is sort of an area of, that's interesting area of intelligence. I was curious if that sort of prompted any kind of.
Oh yeah. So first of all, we as an organism in the universe, so far as we know at this point, are the only thing that actually turns physical processes, physical matter and energy, into something totally virtual, into concepts, into something that doesn't exist. This is why we have the whole dualist problem with how does consciousness arise and so forth. It's really hard to understand what the neural correlates are and so forth. But the point is, we are, as far as I know, unique in that we make this conversion and creation that can't exist anywhere else in the universe. Now, will AI get to a point where it can do that? Maybe, but I'm not necessarily holding my breath yet. But that part of that is part of my response to the idea of, we create things that are unnecessary, not, that aren't needed by ourselves or the universe. They're, call it whimsical, but they serve, I think, part of a purpose in terms of the creative process. Part of the way that we get from A to B is to explore the possible, to explore the domain that isn't, machines can't just go in and do. They can explore a domain in a very methodical, iterative process, but it's not the same as us exploring a range of ideas, a range of, whether it's remanifesting those concepts as a physical object or turning them into some further aspect of the conceptual world, whether that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or some other aspect of our culture. So it's I think interesting to think about it in terms of, okay, is this going to be our future delineation point between ourselves and technology? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting starting point is just to be able to reclaim the definition and meaning of intelligence, because in a way, I think it's been sort of co-opted and it's been diluted through the process of kind of commercial technologies, to such a point where when we have smart homes and we have smart watches and we have everything is smart, and it's like we kind of create the problem. So then when we truly make something that is smart, like we could say it is smart, would we know it, or would we have been made dumb by that process of using that language to the point where it's a little bit of a dilemma?
We've devalued the word, certainly. Yeah, it's that's kind of the intelligence is what Marvin Minsky used to call a suitcase word, and it's this idea that it means so many things to so many people, and it's you have this suitcase. It's like, open it up. It's like, oh, it means this, and it means this, and it means this, and at a certain point, it almost becomes pointless unless we are going to really carefully define what it is. And the same goes for this idea of whether you call it smart, intelligent, what have you. We kind of have to carefully explore even just the language that we're using in order to have some of these conversations.
Awesome. Is there any last questions before we sort of wrap this up? Does anybody else have any final questions for Richard? Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
That was marvelous.
It's been a delight, everyone. I've enjoyed the questions. I've enjoyed your time and engagement. And Tim, as always, it's a joy to converse with you, explore these ideas, and hope to have more opportunities in the future.
We will definitely do that. I look forward to talking soon. Okay.
Okay. All right. I'll sign off if you don't mind. And let
you sign off.
On.
Yep. Thank
All
you.
Right. Take
Talk
care.
to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Hey, I hope you all enjoyed that.